April 24th, 2013, Savar, Bangladesh. An 8-story building collapses in seconds, pancaking floor upon floor, crushing thousands of workers inside. The death toll will reach 1,134 people. Over 2,500 more will be injured. It will become the deadliest garment factory disaster in history and the deadliest accidental structural failure in modern times. But this was no accident. This was a tragedy built on greed, corruption, and the dark reality of how the clothes in your closet reach your hands. This is the story of Rana Plaza, where fast fashion met human cost, and the world was forced to confront what we'd been willfully ignoring. Savar is a city of approximately 1.5 million people, located about 24 kilometers northwest of Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. It's part of the sprawling industrial belt that has made Bangladesh the second largest garment exporter in the world after China. Drive through Savar and you'll see factory after factory, each one churning out clothing destined for stores across Europe, North America, and beyond. The garment industry is Bangladesh's economic lifeblood, accounting for over 80% of the country's exports and employing nearly 4 million workers, most of them women. It's an industry built on one fundamental principle: produce clothes as cheaply as possible, as quickly as possible, for brands that demand rock-bottom prices. In this landscape of concrete factories and crowded streets stood Rana Plaza, an 8-story commercial building constructed in 2006. The building housed several garment factories on its upper floors: Phantom Apparels, Phantom Tack, Ethertex, New Wave Style, and New Wave Bottoms. The owner was Sohail Rana, a local political leader with connections to the ruling Awami League party. He was not an engineer. He was not a construction expert. He was a politically connected businessman who had built an empire on Bangladesh's garment boom. And the building that bore his name was constructed with corner cutting, violations, and bribes that would ultimately cost over 1,000 lives.
Rana Plaza was originally designed as a commercial and retail building, shops and offices, nothing more. It was built on land that was once a pond, filled in with sandy soil. The foundation was inadequate for any significant load. But Sohail Rana had bigger plans. He added 3 additional floors beyond the original 5-story design, all without proper permits or structural assessments. Then he filled those upper floors with garment factories, heavy industrial sewing machines, generators, thousands of workers. The building was literally carrying more weight than it was ever designed to handle. And everyone who needed to care, building inspectors, local authorities, factory owners, looked the other way. Because that's how business worked in Bangladesh's garment sector. Inside Rana Plaza worked thousands of people, mostly young women from rural villages who had come to Dhaka seeking opportunity. The average age was mid-20s. The average wage was about 3,000 taka per month, roughly $38 US. These women worked 6 days a week, often 14-hour shifts, in cramped conditions with poor ventilation and inadequate safety measures. They sewed shirts for Walmart, jeans for Joe Fresh, clothes for Mango, Benetton, and dozens of other Western brands. The label said made in Bangladesh, but what they didn't say was made by women earning $38 a month in a building that shouldn't exist. These workers knew the conditions were bad. They knew the pay was terrible. But for many, it was the only option. The difference between some income and none, between survival and destitution. Every morning, thousands of workers would stream into Rana Plaza, climb the narrow staircases to their factory floors, and take their places at sewing machines arranged in tight rows. The noise was deafening, hundreds of machines running simultaneously, generators rumbling, supervisors shouting. The air was thick with fabric dust.
There were no unions, no meaningful worker protections, no real recourse if conditions became unbearable. You worked or you were replaced by one of the thousands waiting for any job. This was the reality of fast fashion, the hidden human machinery that kept Western consumers supplied with cheap, trendy clothes.
On April 23, 2013, the day before the collapse, workers arriving at Rana Plaza noticed something alarming. Large cracks had appeared in the walls and columns of the building. The cracks were visible, obvious, frightening. Workers pointed them out to supervisors. Supervisors reported them to management. The bank on the lower floor immediately closed and evacuated its employees. The shops on the ground floor shut down. Engineers were called in to inspect the damage. Their assessment was unequivocal. The building was unsafe and should be evacuated immediately. For a few hours, it seemed like tragedy might be averted. Workers were sent home. The building stood empty, its cracks widening almost imperceptibly in the humid heat. But then came the phone calls. Factory owners contacted Sohail Rava. They had orders to fill, deadlines to meet, shipments waiting. Western brands were demanding their products. If production stopped, they'd lose contracts. Money was on the line, lots of it. And in Bangladesh's garment industry, money always spoke louder than safety. Sohail Rana made his decision. The building was fine, he declared. The cracks were minor, cosmetic. An engineer who raised concerns was dismissed. Workers were ordered to report the next morning as usual. Anyone who refused would lose a month's pay. For women earning $38 a month, losing that money meant their families didn't eat. So, they came back. April 24th, 2013, 8 a.m. Thousands of workers entered Rana Plaza, many of them terrified but with no choice. They climbed the stairs, passing the visible cracks in the walls, feeling the building slightly sway, a sensation that had become familiar but never comfortable. They took their places at their machines. Supervisors walked the aisles, making sure everyone was working. Production resumed. The machines hummed. The generators roared to provide electricity when the city power flickered. And the building, already overstressed, already damaged, began to fail. The collapse began at 8:57 a.m. Witnesses outside described hearing a tremendous cracking sound, like thunder, but deeper, more ominous. The 8th floor gave way first, pancaking down onto the 7th. That floor, unable to support the sudden impact of an entire floor collapsing onto it, failed instantly and crashed onto the 6th. Within seconds, a cascading failure ripped through the building. Floor after floor pancaked downward in a progressive collapse, each impact accelerating the destruction. The sound was apocalyptic, concrete shattering, steel rending, the screams of thousands of people disappearing into the roar of destruction. Within 90 seconds, 8 floors of Rana Plaza had collapsed into a twisted mountain of concrete slabs, steel reinforcement bars, and crushed humanity. The building that moments before had housed thousands of workers was now a tomb. The dust cloud that rose from the collapse was visible for kilometers. People across Savar stopped what they were doing, staring in horror at the brown cloud rising from where Rana Plaza had stood. Then came the realization of what had happened, and the screaming began. Families of workers rushed to the site. Local residents came running with whatever tools they had, shovels, crowbars, their bare hands. The scene was chaos. A mountain of rubble 3 stories high stretched across what had been the building's footprint.
From within the debris came sounds that would haunt rescuers forever. The cries and screams of people trapped alive, calling for help, calling for their mothers, their children, their God. Bangladesh's emergency services were immediately overwhelmed. This wasn't just a building collapse. This was a mass casualty event on a scale the country had never faced. Fire brigades, police, military personnel, and volunteers converged on the site, but they faced an impossible task. Thousands of tons of concrete and steel had to be moved piece by piece, and beneath it all were over 3,000 people, dead and alive. Heavy machinery was brought in, cranes, excavators, but they had to work carefully. Too much vibration, too much force, and secondary collapses could kill both victims and rescuers. So much of the work had to be done by hand. Rescuers crawling into unstable voids in the rubble, following sounds of survivors, trying to reach people trapped in pockets of space.
The rescue operation would continue for 17 days. 17 days of workers pulling bodies from the rubble. 17 days of families waiting for news. 17 days of increasingly slim hopes that anyone else would be found alive. In the first hours, dozens of survivors were pulled from the wreckage, injured, traumatized, but alive. These early rescues gave hope. Surely more survivors would be found. But as hours turned to days, the number of live rescues dwindled. The heat was brutal. People trapped without water died of dehydration. Others, pinned beneath concrete, succumbed to crush syndrome when they were finally freed. And many, so many, were simply killed instantly in the collapse. Their bodies recovered days or weeks later. One rescue became a symbol of both hope and horror. On April 28th, 4 days after the collapse, rescuers heard a voice in the rubble. A woman, still alive, trapped beneath multiple floors of concrete. Her name was Rishma Begum, 19 years old, a garment worker. Rescuers worked for hours, carefully removing debris, trying to reach her without causing a secondary collapse. They passed her water through small gaps. They talked to her, kept her conscious, promised they would save her. Finally, after agonizing effort, they pulled her out alive. She had survived on packets of dry food she found in the rubble and bottles of water. Her rescue, broadcast live on television, gave the nation a moment of joy amid the tragedy. But Rishma was one of the last. After her, the rescue stopped, and only bodies were recovered. The survivors who emerged told stories that revealed the true horror of Rana Plaza. Sheila Begum, 23, described the moment of collapse. Everything went dark. I couldn't breathe. I could hear people screaming all around me, then the screaming got quieter and quieter. I was trapped under concrete with dead bodies around me. I thought I would die there. She was pulled out after 16 hours, both legs crushed. She would never walk normally again. Another survivor, Sumi Abdin, had worked at Rana Plaza for 3 years. She described how supervisors had threatened workers the morning of the collapse. They said if we didn't come to work, we would lose our jobs. They said the building was safe. They lied. And my friends died because of those lies. The families waiting outside the collapsed building faced their own agony. Many workers didn't have official identification. Many families didn't know exactly where their daughters or wives worked, just somewhere in Rana Plaza. As bodies were recovered, they were laid out in rows for identification. Families moved among them, looking for familiar faces, familiar clothing, anything that would tell them if their loved one was among the dead. Some searched for days. Some never found their family members. The bodies were too damaged, too decomposed in the heat, or simply impossible to identify. Over 300 victims would never be identified, buried in mass graves, leaving families without even the closure of a proper burial.
The scale of the disaster was staggering. Final counts confirmed 1,134 deaths and 2,500 injured. It was the deadliest garment factory disaster in history, surpassing the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 in New York. But while Triangle had led to sweeping labor reforms in America, would Rana Plaza do the same for Bangladesh? The initial signs were not encouraging. So Rana, the owner of the building, tried to flee to India, but was captured at the border. He was arrested and charged with murder. But the factory owners, the government officials who had accepted bribes to overlook violations, the brands that demanded cheap production at any cost, would they face justice too? The investigation revealed what many had suspected but few wanted to acknowledge. Rana Plaza had been a disaster waiting to happen, a tragedy built into every brick and beam. The building had been constructed on inadequate foundations, on filled-in pondland that couldn't support the weight. 3 illegal floors had been added without structural reinforcement. The factories had installed heavy generators on upper floors, creating vibrations that weakened the structure. Building inspectors had been bribed to approve permits. Local authorities had ignored complaints. And when cracks appeared the day before the collapse, a final warning that could have saved over 1,000 lives, workers were ordered back inside under the threat of losing their wages. Every level of society, from corrupt officials to desperate factory owners to global brands demanding impossible prices, had contributed to the disaster.
The global reaction was swift and furious. Images of the collapsed building, of bodies being pulled from rubble, of survivors with crushed limbs spread across social media and news outlets. Activists identified the brands whose labels were found in the rubble: Walmart, Joe Fresh, Mango, Benetton, and others. Some brands denied involvement. Others admitted they had products manufactured at Rana Plaza, but claimed they didn't know about the conditions. The excuses rang hollow. For years, labor advocates had been documenting the dangerous conditions in Bangladesh's garment factories. Reports had been published, warnings had been issued, but brands had continued to source from Bangladesh because the prices were unbeatable. Now the true cost was visible for the world to see. A movement emerged from the tragedy. The hashtag #WhoMadeMyClothes trended globally as consumers demanded transparency from fashion brands. Protests erupted outside stores. Shareholders pressured companies to reform their supply chains. In Bangladesh, garment workers organized strikes and demonstrations, demanding better wages and safer conditions. For the first time, the usually invisible workers who made the world's clothes were making their voices heard. The pressure led to tangible changes. Over 200 brands signed the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, a legally binding agreement requiring regular safety inspections of factories. The Bangladesh government raised minimum wages for garment workers, though activists argued the increase was insufficient. Some factories improved conditions, installed fire exits, reinforced structures. But critics pointed out that these reforms only came after 1,134 people had died, and that enforcement remained weak. Compensation for victims and families was complicated and inadequate. A trust fund was established with contributions from brands and the government. Families of the dead were promised compensation, as were injured workers, but the process was slow, bureaucratic, and many families reported receiving far less than promised. Some injured workers, unable to return to garment work, fell into poverty. The promised compensation was supposed to cover lost income, medical expenses, and pain and suffering. But how do you compensate for the loss of a daughter who was supporting her entire family? How do you compensate for crushed limbs, for trauma, for the nightmares that never stop? The money, when it came, felt like a bitter acknowledgement that some lives were worth more than others.
and that Bangladeshi garment workers' lives were valued far below those in wealthier countries. The human stories from Rana Plaza are what give the tragedy its true weight. Consider Sheila, mentioned earlier, who lost her ability to walk. Before the collapse, she had been saving money to help her younger sister attend school. After the collapse, both sisters had to drop out. Sheila because she couldn't work, her sister because the family needed her income. Or consider Rupa, 20 years old, who had only been working at Rana Plaza for 3 months. She sent most of her salary back to her village to support her parents and younger siblings. She died on the 5th floor. Her body wasn't recovered for 8 days. Her family used the compensation money to pay off debts, leaving nothing for a memorial.
And consider the supervisor, Abdul, 35, who had worked his way up from machine operator to floor supervisor over 10 years. He was one of the people who ordered workers back into the building on April 24th, following instructions from management. He died in the collapse too. His widow was left to wonder, was he a victim or was he complicit? The question haunted her, just as it haunted Bangladesh. Who was responsible? The building owner, certainly. The factory owners, absolutely. But what about the government officials who accepted bribes? The engineers who falsified reports? The brands that demanded impossible prices? The consumers who wanted cheap clothes without asking how they could be so cheap? The blame spread like cracks through concrete, touching everyone and no one. 10 years after the collapse, Rana Plaza remains a scar on Bangladesh's landscape and conscience. The rubble has been cleared. A memorial has been proposed but never built. The land remains contested, claimed by multiple parties. Some survivors have rebuilt their lives, many haven't. The garment industry in Bangladesh continues to boom, employing even more workers than in 2013. Conditions have improved in some factories, but labor advocates report that many improvements were superficial, designed to pass inspections rather than genuinely protect workers. The fundamental economic model hasn't changed. Bangladesh's competitive advantage is still its cheap labor, and that means keeping wages as low as possible. The fashion brands that were implicated in the disaster have moved on. Some implemented robust monitoring programs. Others quietly shifted production to other countries with even less oversight: Ethiopia, Myanmar, Vietnam. The Accord on Fire and Building Safety, which made real improvements, ended in 2020 and was replaced by a weaker, industry-led monitoring system. Without sustained pressure, brands revert to what they've always done: seeking the lowest cost, maximizing profit, and keeping the true price of clothing hidden from consumers who would rather not know. But some things have changed permanently. A generation of consumers became aware, perhaps for the first time, that their cheap t-shirts came at a human cost. The slow fashion movement gained momentum, encouraging people to buy less, buy better, and ask questions about who made their clothes and under what conditions. Labor activists, emboldened by global attention, have continued pushing for reforms in Bangladesh and other garment-producing countries. Some brands have genuinely improved their practices, implementing living wages and ensuring safe conditions, and the survivors and families of Rana Plaza have refused to let the world forget. They organize annual memorials, give interviews, travel to speak at conferences, demanding that their loss mean something.
The question Rana Plaza forces us to confront is uncomfortable. How much is a life worth? When we buy a t-shirt for $5, we're making an implicit calculation. We're saying that the convenience and price matter more than the conditions under which it was made. We're saying that the life of a Bangladeshi garment worker, her safety, her wages, her dignity, is worth less than our desire for cheap, disposable fashion. The brands tell us they're monitoring their supply chains, improving conditions, ensuring safety. But Rana Plaza taught us to be skeptical of those promises, because those promises were made before too, and 1,134 people still died. The building collapsed in 90 seconds, but the tragedy of Rana Plaza was decades in the making. It was built on a global economic system that treats human beings as disposable inputs in a production process. It was built on corruption that allowed substandard construction to pass inspection. It was built on desperation that forced workers to enter a building they knew was unsafe. It was built on consumer demand for endless cheap clothes, no questions asked. And it collapsed under the weight of all those failures at once, bringing down not just concrete and steel, but the illusion that we could have it all: cheap prices, fast fashion, and clean consciences. On April 24th each year, survivors and families gather at the site of Rana Plaza. They bring flowers, photographs, candles. They read the names of the dead, 1,134 names that take hours to recite. They demand that the proposed memorial finally be built, that the victims be honored, that the world never forget. And they ask the question that hangs over the entire tragedy: was anything learned? Have conditions really changed? Or are there other Rana Plazas out there right now, buildings on the edge of collapse, filled with workers who have no choice but to enter, while the rest of us scroll through online stores looking for deals? The answer is both hopeful and devastating. Some things have improved. Some workers are safer. Some brands have reformed. But the fundamental dynamics remain: the pressure for cheap production, the race to the bottom on wages, the willingness to cut corners when no one is looking. Rana Plaza showed us the true cost of fast fashion. Whether we're willing to pay a different price, in money, in convenience, in conscious consumption, remains to be seen. For 1,134 people, the question came too late. For millions of garment workers still laboring in questionable conditions around the world, the question is urgently current. And for every person who buys clothing, the question is personal. Who made your clothes? Under what conditions? At what cost? These are the questions Rana Plaza demands we ask, and we owe it to those who died to never stop asking them.